Biostatistics at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and I'm one of the student introducers this morning for Dr. David Stuckler. He is a professor of political economy and sociology at the University of Oxford and a research fellow of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in Chatham House. He has written over 140 peer-reviewed scientific articles on global health in The Lancet, the British Medical Journal, and Nature, in addition to other major journals. His book about the global chronic disease epidemic, Sick Societies, was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. He is also an author of The Body Economic, published by Penguin Press in 2013 and translated into over 10 languages. His work has featured on the covers of the New York Times and The Economist, among other venues. Foreign Policy named him one of the top 100 global thinkers in 2013, and we are honored to have him this morning as our keynote speaker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Stuckler.
Sarah, thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to join you here today. I'm Dr. David Stuckler. I lead an Institute for Social Protection at Oxford University. And it starts from the understanding that health is about more than just health care. Good health starts in our communities, not in our doctor's offices. And that's why one of the most powerful determinants of your health is your zip code. So our program builds on three core social determinants of health: food, housing, and jobs, to try to understand how to prevent ill health before it starts. It's great to come back to Harvard as well, where I started off as an assistant professor. It's been now 4 years since I was last here, and at the time, America was just coming out of the worst crisis since the Great Depression. People had lost homes, people had lost jobs, but in Europe, the crisis has continued and continued to escalate. Right now, Greece teeters on the brink of bankruptcy, Europe on disintegrating. Job loss stands at 40% of people in places like Spain and Portugal who look for work and can't find it, the scale of which is a public health epidemic. So often, in the midst of this suffering, politicians have been debating endlessly how to deal with debts, how to deal with deficits, much created from the bailouts of the financial sector, pursuing a means of deep budget cuts in the name of austerity, reducing the role of social safety nets and social protection programs. And all too often, the voices of those affected by these powerful forces goes unheard, lost. But now you may be wondering, who is this boy who is not on the screen just yet? The slides go up. Just want to introduce you to Kieran McArdle. At the ripe age of 13, he's already bitter. He blames the British government for killing his father. It may be hard to see at the back. He's holding a picture of Brian McArdle. Brian had worked as a security guard for about 20 years in a little town near Glasgow, until about 3 Christmases ago, he suffered a massive stroke and left him blind in one eye, paralyzed, and unable to speak. So to make ends meet for his family, Brian turned to the government, the British government, for support. That government, in the hands of the British Conservative Party, would prove no friend to the McArdles. For in an effort to tackle what they called an epidemic of welfare scroungers, people cheating the disability system, they contracted Atos, a French systems integration firm, to start performing fitness for work assessments. So Brian like many others, was called in. He was a little concerned, as he had heard about a quarter of these assessments were taking place in buildings that weren't wheelchair accessible. But he went to the test, and he did his best. 2 weeks later, brown envelope came through the post. His support had been cut with immediate effect. Brian had been deemed fit for work. The next day, Brian dropped dead, this time from a massive heart attack. And that's why Karen blames the government for killing his dad. Now, as a public health researcher, it's very difficult to understand the government's logic in this conversation. What I have here is a spreadsheet, financial data, on how much the government estimated was the cost to taxpayers due to fraud and disability. And at the time of these screenings, it was about $3 million each year. Well, the contract with Atos, the private company doing these screenings, was $400 million a year, costing taxpayers more, even as it put people in harm's way. And this is the irony that we've seen in our studies across countries and over time, that many policies designed in the name of austerity have had the opposite of their intended effects. Rather than shrink deficits and debts, they've made them worse. Austerity has been a massive experiment on the people of Europe. We're told by Olli Rehn, who's the head of Europe's Monetary and Finance Commission, that there is no alternative to deep program of cuts. By George Osborne, the financial chancellor of the UK, said there is no plan B. But when we look across crises, when we look across countries, we see a natural experiment on a tremendous scale that's unfolded. Here I have some of the earliest evidence, economic results, of how austerity has affected the economy. And you can compare the tale of the US and UK. Both had highly leveraged banks that were in the epicenter of the economic storm. And as we know, it came tumbling with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the second quarter of 2008. Both countries bailed out their banks to the tune of over $1 trillion. We are fantastically rich. And charted a slow but steady recovery. But in the UK, as you can see in the green line below, a turning point came when the government embarked on a path to pursue a deep program of cuts to health and social welfare programs, where the US, under Barack Obama, pursued a stimulus path, injecting over $800 billion into Medicare, support for Medicaid, education, and investing in science. Unless you think I'm just cherry-picking countries, I could give numerous examples. Portugal had a similar path, and on turning to austerity, the economy went into reverse. But I'm not here to talk about economic evidence, important as it is. What I'm here to talk about is health. And what we've learned from a decade of our work on economic crises is this well-known association that we show to our students. That here we have on the x-axis social welfare spending per capita across countries. This is from early childhood development through to housing subsidies through to old age pension, social spending and life expectancy. And what I'm going to argue today is that this positive correlation is not just a mere association, but a cause and effect relationship seen across societies and over time. So to test out this social protection thesis, we've been looking at cases from around the globe. And one I mentioned earlier is Greece, which has been Europe's guinea pig for austerity measures. When this started back in 2011, a journalist asked the then health minister, Andreas Loverdos, are you really going to try to cut hospital budgets by 40% in 1 year? For those of you working hospitals here, 40% cut. It's an eye-watering sum. And the minister said, look, these aren't cuts with a surgical scalpel, but a butcher's knife. We've got no choice. And when you look at the budget sheet of public health in Greece, it does look like someone took a cleaver just straight down the line to their public health programs. The goal was to get public health spending down to 6% of GDP from what it once was, about 9%. Now, where the economists came up with the 6% figure is still something of a mystery to our team, because Germany was spending around 10%, and the UK we spend around 9%, the US in total spends around 20%. But that was a target, and so the cuts took effect. Now, so often in epidemiology, there's a lag time between an exposure and an effect. So smoking, you wouldn't see lung cancer for several decades, but the impact of these cuts has been rapid. There's one example. Greece became the only nation in Europe to experience a substantial outbreak of HIV in this crisis. To save money, injection drug use programs were slashed in half. The World Health Organization estimates there should be about 200 clean needles per drug user available, and street charities estimate today in Athens there's about 3. And what we found is an outbreak that happened not in 2008, not in 2009 when the recession started, but starting in 2011 when these cuts took effect. There was a 10-fold rise in HIV concentrated in injection drug users. The government tried to blame it on sex workers, migrants coming from North Africa, but the data tell a different story. And we've been trying to get our hands on all the data we could to tell the story, while everyone was debating about Greece's debts and financial collapse, of the real story of suffering, what was happening to the health of her people. When mosquito spraying programs were cut, for the first time, Greece experienced a return of malaria since the early 1970s. And in a paper we published just last year in The Lancet, we documented a range of consequences of the cuts, from a 50% jump in people reporting they could no longer access health care they felt was medically necessary, to a jump in stillbirths in hospitals, to a wave of suicides that continues. I could go on about Greece. It paints a picture of a nation, a developed nation, that in a span of a few years saw its healthcare system collapse under the pressure of deep cuts. But I want to turn your attention to a different crisis that was equally, if not even more, calamitous. I want to take you to the shores of Iceland. And if you were in Reykjavik, like I was back in 2009, your TV would have been interrupted by this man, Gerhard, Prime Minister. He had called an emergency announcement with block white letters appearing on the screen, "God bless Iceland," to warn this tiny nation of the worst crisis since World War II. All of Iceland's banks had failed, and the country's debt rocketed to 900% of GDP, making it the worst debt, apart from Zimbabwe, on record. And for a nation that had just squandered all of its banking assets, like Greece, it had few economic options. So it too turned to the International Monetary Fund, the European partners, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, for a bailout. And that bailout, similar to the package Greece was handed, came with strict financial conditions, aiming to cut the social protection and health budget by about 50% in the span of 3 to 5 years. Remember, I was with the health minister at the time at the main European health policy conference in Gastein, Austria. Highly recommend going if you ever have a moment. And he took to joking, what's the difference between the IMF and a vampire? One stops sucking your blood when you're already dead. And jokes aside, what I didn't know is that at that time he had hatched a plan. For when he got back to Iceland after that conference, he resigned, saying it was unfair and inequitable to ask the Icelandic people to pay for the greed and mistakes of the bankers. And clearly, this message got through because in the following days, people spilled onto the streets with stop signs, the IMF on it, saying no, refusing to go with the plan. And it tipped the president of this nation to take perhaps the most radical step we've seen in the crisis. He asked the people what they wanted. He called a referendum. And so it was. In March of 2010, 93% of Icelanders voted no. They said no to the plan to bail out the banks and to sign up to a program of deep cuts. And we'd been working with the Icelandic School of Public Health and wanted to know what was going to happen because this sent financial markets into turmoil. Iceland's currency plummeted. The price of medicines, much of which was imported, was rocketing as a result. And the Icelanders, though they had a universal health system, saw the biggest threat to health they'd seen in decades. As the president said, we did the opposite of what the Western financial world has done in response to crises over the past 3 decades. We let the banks fail. We provided support for the poor, and we didn't introduce austerity measures like had been happening elsewhere. So what happened? In the first UN World Happiness Report, published right about 2011, when Greece was going down the path of austerity, Iceland, which was once one of the world's happiest nations, was again one of the world's happiest nations. We didn't see any loss in healthcare access apart from dental care, which is privately financed in Iceland, thanks in part to a big injection of stimulus funding to keep the system going. We look particularly at the health of vulnerable groups, people who had lost jobs, so commonly seen to be at risk of depression, suicidal thoughts. Instead, we found in surveys they reported they were sleeping more and spending more time with their families. And an odd twist, as the currency plummeted, McDonald's pulled out of the country, citing operational difficulties. Apparently, importing tomatoes was making Big Macs too expensive. Hadn't realized there were tomatoes in Big Macs. And people turned to consuming local tuna, which had long been the nation's main product, and haven't seen nutrition experts evaluate the consequences, but I suspect it's an improvement. And you would think this approach would be terribly costly if you believe there's no plan B, there's no alternative. But even the International Monetary Fund had to take a look at growth in Iceland and Greece, scratch its head, and will say, well, you can't argue with 4% economic growth and unemployment rates below 5%, praising its unorthodox recovery. Iceland's returned to growth where Greece, some of the latest data we have in this dashed line, is still sinking. So obviously Greece and Iceland are two extremes. What can we make of this comparison? Iceland sits outside of the European Union. It's not on the euro, so it had more flexibility than Greece and how to respond. It's also a nation that has one of the highest rates of political participation worldwide. If you ask the Icelanders, have you been in touch with your member of parliament, equivalent of their local Congress member? Over 80% say they have in the past 3 months. I don't know how many of you have contacted your local congressman. It's good for your health. What this contrast proves is that even a terrible economic crisis need not impact people's health if politicians take steps to protect the weak. Fiscal policy is a matter of life and death. To further test out the social protection thesis, we've also looked to the past. And one of the crises that's been invoked frequently is the Great Depression in the United States. It too had origins in a troubled housing sector. And it too was characterized by a remarkable lack of foresight. The world's leading economist, arguably at the time Irving Fisher, had written that stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. That was Tuesday in October 1929. 2 days later, Black Thursday, it all came tumbling. America's economy crashed, all too familiar to those of you. Unemployment reached a quarter of the workforce, and my historical colleagues argue that the hardship in its wake paved the way for the rise of fascism and ultimately World War II in Europe. We wanted to study what happened to health in the crisis. When we look back through the historical records at the time, we expected to see a massive crisis unfolding before our eyes. But instead, we saw the head of the American Medical Association write in to the New York Times, proudly proclaiming that never before had there been such good health conditions as during the Great Depression. We were scratching our heads, wondering what was going on. And that led us to collect data from the Center for Disease Control's historical archives. I'm not sure how many people have been down to their basements and dusty tomes, but we were able to get data from what was then 114 major US cities, mortality rates from different causes, and we were able to confirm that mortality rates fell, coinciding with the Great Depression, by about 10%. That was a period where there was a lot going on. Those of you studying public health will know a familiar pattern of the epidemiologic transition, where infectious disease rates were falling, chronic non-communicable disease rates were rising, but these were longer-term patterns. We drilled in closer to the data. We found that although suicide rates did spike in connection with unemployment, importantly, deaths from road traffic injuries fell, and fell sharply. At the time, road safety was a foreign concept, and for the first time in the history of the car, people to save money were walking more and driving less. But what was critical, what prevented a disaster, had to do with two major political decisions, one of which I recommend and one of which I won't. I think you can figure out which. The first of these was what was called a great experiment at the time. It was led by a movement of women who had recently gained the right to vote, who had pushed for temperance, prohibition on alcohol. It had started in 1919. And of course, it was still possible to obtain alcohol through speakeasies and other illegal means, but it made it much harder for people to gain access to self-harm. And it was lifted as part of an economic recovery strategy in 1933. to bring in sin taxes and shore up deficits. When we looked at the data, we found that this kept alcohol-related harm flat during the recession until it was lifted in the 1930s. The consequences were never evaluated. The second important policy had to do with the same debate we're going through today. We'll be going through again when the next recession, and I say when, because not if, but when the next recession hits, and that's how to deal with the budget deficit. The incumbent president at the time, Herbert Hoover, argued that people should pick themselves up by their bootstraps, work hard to power recovery. And for those lined up around outside food kitchens, they started to nickname Hoovervilles. This idea felt a little out of touch. His opponent, Franklin Roosevelt, campaigned instead for a program that would build new homes to keep roofs over the heads of Americans who had lost them, for a works programs administrations that would create new jobs for people who could not find them, to use the crisis as an opportunity to invest in schools, education, and infrastructure that would power a recovery. He called his plan a New Deal, and he won. But it created another natural experiment, because in the US, across the different states which had to implement this program, not everyone agreed. And so some of the left-leaning governors thought it needed to go even further and pushed more into New Deal relief spending, where others, in places at the time like Kansas, they sought to undermine it and not implement it altogether. So this created what the econometricians in the audience will know as an instrumental variable approach, so that we could begin to better understand the causal effect of these differences in spending. What we found is that the New Deal spending created a polarization in health across the US that endures today. We found where there was greater spending on social protection, there were greater falls in suicides, reductions in, at the time, whooping cough, which was endemic, and improvements in childhood survival. The New Deal, in effect, was the biggest program of public health prevention ever implemented on US soil. I want to bring you, with this backdrop, to another crisis. It tells a different tale, and a crisis that, in those two policy respects, was the complete opposite. And this is one that most of you have lived through. And this began in 1989, the eve of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Much like the Great Depression, unemployment rocketed, GDP fell by a third, as the countries began to transition from a shattered system of socialism to try to build market capitalism. And as you can see, in Russia, it looks like a roller coaster, and then the bottom falls out in the early 1990s when it became an independent state. The worst mortality crisis in a time of peace that we've seen in the past 50 years. Over 3 million excess deaths in Russia alone. When we did our post-mortem of this crisis, one of the key factors opposite of prohibition we found was alcohol, which was being produced on an industrial scale, from home brews to especially these. These are aftershaves marketed not by their flavor, but by their scent, and with a flip-top cap, because, well, why would you need to use it more than once? People were drinking these. I can assure you they're absolutely vile. We found that drinking these compared with just ordinary home-brewed vodka increased the hazard of dying with 26-fold within a span of a few months. The question, though, was why were people drinking these so much more in some places than others, and to such a degree that had not been seen before? And this, too, came back to a big debate about how to handle economic troubles in these nations. Your former president here, Larry Summers, writing in 1994, said, "There'd never been such unanimity among economists as with what to do in Eastern Europe." He called for a program of what came to be known as shock therapy to implement privatization, stabilization is a word for austerity, rapidly. Except not all countries followed that advice, like today. And those countries, we found, that pursued a course of making deep holes in their budgets to try to eliminate the Soviet-era redistributive systems to make sure the communists never came back to power, we found experienced a devastating crisis. Here I have a comparison of Russia and Belarus. Russia, within the span of 500 days, turned its system almost completely over to the market, creating the now famous oligarchs. And with it, shattered its system of healthcare provision, much which was provided by Soviet firms in mono-industrial towns. Or if you look at Belarus, this neighboring country, a country that was critiqued as being a Soviet theme park for failing to do just about anything, it wasn't exactly on a favorable trend, but had continued along the path it had followed. Because not everyone agreed with our analysis, and The Economist was quick to jump to its defense, for it had advocated the rapid Big Bang approach to transition. And what I have here on the top is the real data, the life expectancy roller coaster I showed you earlier, and how The Economist magazine redrew it using 5-year intervals, not at the 0 and 5, but 2 and 7, which were the only ones that could make the mortality crisis look like an inevitable decline from Stalin. We took to joking that if Stalin could do millions with the stroke of a pen, The Economist could bring them back again with a click of a mouse. The point is, if you work in this area on who determines the social determinants of health, grow thick skin. So when we had seen these trends and we had seen the extremes of the US and Eastern Europe and confronting a reality of a potential breakup of the EU, much like what happened to the Soviet bloc, we wanted to get our hands on the data that could tell us what policies could prevent harm. And we've been publishing a range of papers. I won't go through them all. I'll give just one example of what we've begun to find. The pattern that we had seen in the Great Depression of suicides rising and traffic accidents falling is a pattern that we found to be quite general across the US. This is exactly what happened in the US during the recession in this period, and it's what we found across Europe. If there are two generalities, this is what we see, and because traffic accidents are a bigger cause of death, especially for people under age 30, tends to bring down a slight reduction in mortality rates overall. We wanted to go further and understand the correlation between economic hardship and suicide has been known since the 19th century. Was there something we could do? Was there something that we could learn from our wealth of experiences as different societies? Would we need to blindly accept the suffering, or could we prevent it? And what we started to see in the data was a different picture that, yes, we could. Here I have on your left Spain, with unemployment in the red and suicide in the blue. And broadly, this picture in Spain is the pattern we've seen in many places, what we've seen in this recession, that when unemployment went up, suicides went up. When unemployment went down, suicides went down. But if you look on your right, you see a quite different picture. Here you see in the early 90s, Sweden's banking crisis that led unemployment to jump by about 10 percentage points. If you look at the blue, suicides, it's as though nothing had happened. Sweden was able to decouple shocks in its economy from the health of its people. When we drilled closer into the data, we found that much of this was linked to how Sweden put in place supports for people who had lost jobs to help them back on their feet. And we wanted to then look again and see if this happened in this crisis. Here I've got a picture from the UK. I could do the same for the US, where unemployment jumped. We saw suicides jump. And that is the pattern we saw in this crisis, where countries that had poorly resourced programs to help people who had lost jobs, to provide case support, to help them with their job search, we found a direct connection between unemployment and suicide. But in those in this crisis that had a stronger system, more like Sweden's and less like the US and UK, we saw this decoupling happen once again. That unemployment went up, but suicide continued to fall. So yes, there is something we can do, and that's a very positive message, because it means that there are smart ways we can help our economies and also invest in the health of our people. So this is, when we saw this information, we were excited. We went to Swedish Parliament and presented it, and we went to the European Commission and shared it with the International Monetary Fund and Troika partners. And once again, we found not everyone agreed. We got a letter after we published our paper on the Greek crisis for the first time, warning of a tragedy if preventative measures weren't taken. We got a letter from a Dr. Lyropoulos in the BMJ who said, look, there's no evidence that the crisis has become a health hazard. And that, in fact, those budget reductions, where they got health spending down to 6% of GDP, now it's down to 4% of GDP, he said was an improvement in efficiency. We were mystified. Because just the time he was writing, we had Mark Springer, who heads up the European Center for Disease Control, the counterpart of the CDC, who had done a site visit in Greece. He went to hospitals and found there were places that didn't even have budget for surgical gloves, alcohol wipes, gowns. Was alarmed by the prospect of drug-resistant infections spreading on the wards. And Dr. Friedman, who did a site visit from the US, heads HIV, said, look, the Greek government are creating an epicenter for the resurgence of HIV in Greece and beyond. So we were puzzled where Lyropoulos was coming from until, that is, when my students looked at his CV and found he was the chief in charge of implementing austerity in Greece. So what we've found from Europe has been consistent with what we've seen in tobacco companies and alcohol companies, a denial of the evidence of the harm. And this denialism is a major threat to population health. But there are some who have turned tail, and some who we did not expect to turn tail. One of them being the International Monetary Fund. See, it had projected that if Greece followed its plan of deep budget cuts, it would get 4% growth. Well, instead, its economy was shrinking year on year by about 4%. So there was clearly a problem with something. And in a paper I highly recommend as nighttime reading, the chief economist of the fund wrote a paper, Growth Forecast Errors and Fiscal Multipliers, just about 2 years ago. And what they concluded is that we underestimated the negative effect of austerity on employment and spending power. This is an important debate because it goes right to the heart of austerity versus stimulus, to make deep cuts to health or to invest in health. And that has relevance to all of us working in healthcare. It dealt with an arcane statistic known as the fiscal multiplier. And this tells you for each dollar of government spending, how much do you get back? So if that's bigger than 1, it means you get a return on investment. If it's less, it's like throwing a bomb at the economy. Now, the IMF had assumed from past crises that this multiplier was less than 1. So it would save money by making cuts, expansionary austerity, and you had economists here, particularly Ken Rogoff and others who were proponents in this camp. Ollie Wren, who I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, cited repeatedly Ken Rogoff's work in justifying austerity in Greece. But when they looked at the actual data, they found the multiplier was closer to about 1.7. And that's what led them to say austerity had been a mistake. Now, even this had a major assumption behind his calculations, and one that I'd hope our students wouldn't make, and that's it assumed all government spending was affecting the economy in equal ways. There's very little nuance in data in the arguments about austerity. Government spending bad, government spending good. What we did is we then took the IMF study and we disaggregated it by type of spending. I've got a forest plot here. I love these forest plots. And what we did is we looked at the multiplier by defense, environment, health, education. And what we found is that health, social protection, and education had some of the biggest and most positive fiscal multipliers, whereas defense and economic affairs, that's the term for bank bailouts, were negative, smaller. And we found that they were leading to trade deficits. Money and defense may have been flowing to Afghanistan, but it wasn't helping the people of Europe. And the same with bank bailouts. They may have been flowing to offshore tax havens, but it wasn't helping create jobs or power a real meaningful recovery in people's lives. So in the New Deal, we see this multiplier in action. Roosevelt didn't know it at the time, but he was in line with the evidence. It's what we then see when we look just at a helicopter view across Europe, what's happening. Here I have on the x-axis change in government spending, and then on the y, change in GDP, or the rate of recovery. You can see at the bottom left Greece, Hungary, Lithuania, Europe's guinea pigs for austerity. Where if you get on the top right, you see Finland, Japan, Sweden, Germany. Germany preaches the virtues of austerity for others. So you would think, with this accumulation of evidence, that austerity is bad for the economy, but even if you wanted to do austerity, there's a smart way to do it, that this would then change the way policy is being done. I just was looking this morning, and even with Syriza, even with the effort of the Greek government to hold a referendum, that, by the way, rejected austerity, the next tranche of the bailout is going to cost more and continue to go down the path of deep cuts. And this is leading to the situation now with no gowns, no alcohol wipes in hospitals. This is happening in Europe, a rich society. So it can't be ignorance of the data. Perhaps it's for lack of an alternative, because what our team is doing now is just analyzing more data on the impacts of austerity. And here we've got one that's hot off the press at the BMJ. While food banks are prevalent here, the UK has long taken the approach of providing enough income for people to afford food. That argument is no longer tenable in Austerity UK. What you see on the left is the map of food banks in the UK that have exploded to now the map of Food Bank UK in 2013. And we found these were opening up and giving more food in direct line with deeper cuts to social protection. So where our team is now going is to look for alternatives, a real alternative. And I often cite a personal hero of mine, Nye Bevan. And he was the Minister of Health under the Labour Party in post-World War II Britain. It was a time when debt in the UK was over 400% of GDP. The economy was shattered from the devastation of the war. And Bevan had said that despite our financial and economic anxieties, we're still able to do the most civilized thing, to put the welfare of the sick in front of every other consideration. He was speaking on the eve of founding the National Health Service, a National Health Service that provided care free of charge to all at a time when debt was quadruple what it is today. Again, there were people who said, this is crazy, you can't do this, it's going to break the bank. How can we afford it? You're passing the buck on to future generations. Well, once again, we see the fiscal multiplier in action. 1948, the eve of the founding of the National Health Service, was the peak in British debt. Within a decade, it had halved. And in a decade still, it halved again. So the founding of the welfare state in Britain didn't break the bank. Like the fiscal multiplier, it helped power recovery. Until we see debt to GDP start to change in the early 1980s. Something very different began to happen and continued to rise and rise. That's for a different talk. Where I want to leave you is with just a couple final points. When you ask, and you can say, well, David, it's all well and good. You've shown economic evidence, you've shown health evidence, but really, these are democracies. It matters what people think, and the UK is just different from Iceland. The UK people want austerity. Okay, well, we then took a look at the data and asked, well, what do people want? It would be great if they had a referendum. But here we have just one of the main sources of social attitude data on if people want to keep taxes the same or if they want to increase taxes and spend more on health. I'd love to see these data for the US. And the support for what's happening, can you guess which line? The support for what's happening to cut taxes for the wealthy and to cut health, education, social spending, that's what's going on. It's been pretty consistently less than 10% of the population. And I suspect it would be similar here. So my plan for Europe and North America is democratic. It's worked in the past. I believe it would work again. I call it a New Deal. And at its core are three core principles that I hold dear. One, ancient law of higher healing, first do no harm. If austerity had been organized like a drug trial, it would have been stopped, given evidence of its harm and the failure of its purported benefits to accrue. We could follow Iceland's lead and set up rapid response health impact assessments to understand, to monitor in live terms, not just the economic impact of our budget choices, but the real impact on what matters to people, their health and the well-being of their families. Second, we should treat unemployment like the pandemic it is, a leading cause of depression, suicides, alcoholism, infectious disease spread, to name a few. What we found is that smart programs, activating labor market programs, can not only help work return to people, but can save money on welfare bills and healthcare costs. And finally, fiscal multiplier, an argument that should be no surprise to those of you in health. Invest in prevention, invest in public health. The cliche, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, is really true. The irony is that the epidemics Greece is now in the grip of, malaria, HIV, drug-resistant infections on the wards, resurging tuberculosis, I could go on. They're costing more to control than they would have been to prevent in the first place. Investing in health is a wise choice in the good times and an urgent necessity in the worst of times. a bit of shameless self-advertising. The body economic, find out more, make a difference. It's a pleasure joining you. Thank you. I'm looking at a Chiro to see if we have time for questions. I'm getting the eye. Yes. Questions, comments, disagreements?
David, thank you for your talk. Nancy Krieger, Professor of Social Epidemiology here at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. I think overall the argument you present is one that is well accepted among people who have cared about social justice and public health for quite some time with regard to evidence. And the thing that I would just like to caution a little about is in your interpretation of data around the Great Depression in the United States. There was a lot of work done actually at the time, particularly led by Edgar Sidenstricker. He was an economist who was the first statistician at the US Public Health Service. And he emphasized the importance and arguments that were held at that time of not focusing solely on mortality data. Because the problem with focusing solely on mortality data is that while you capture the things that have acute precipitants, you don't capture long-term effects. He took that as an opportunity to set up, for example, the 10-city survey that was done in the United States, which is forerunner to our national health interview survey. And he did a lot of work to demonstrate the importance of actually looking at the harms that were caused, not minimizing them, because they were in debates with economists at the time who were saying actually there wasn't that big of a mortality effect. And given that there wasn't that big of a mortality effect, we actually don't have a crisis on our hands. So that's one aspect in which I think it's worth referring back to the papers that Sidenstricker published extensively in Public Health Reports, which is the leading organ of the US Public Health Services, also Milbank Memorial Quarterly. And secondly, the other part that I think that's extremely important in talking about the New Deal in the context of the United States is understanding that it wasn't a New Deal for everyone equally, and that the racial injustice that was also built into the New Deal is very important in terms of how Social Security legislation was passed, and Sidenstricker was part of that in terms of the agricultural workers and the domestic workers that were excluded. And therefore, I think in a time and a place in the United States where we are such concerns about the links between racial injustice and economic injustice, that it's important that that aspect of the New Deal be discussed as well.
Absolutely great comments. I mean, Sidenstricker's work was critical for setting up surveillance on morbidity that got beyond crude mortality measures. I mean, in the US, there's still a way to go. In Europe, situations worse. Greece's census is looking at being canceled. There isn't a set of representative longitudinal surveys over time that can tell us what's happening to the health of people. And it reflects the low priority politicians place on health compared with financial information. Where we've got up to the millisecond data that can tell us about inequalities in the stock market, but what we have on health, if it exists, is years out of date. In terms of the New Deal, I don't have time to go into it fully, but Nancy is correct on this one, that you could see that whites disproportionately benefited from relief spending, and it's possible now with the data we've accumulated to compare the health trajectories of blacks and whites, which also continue to diverge at this time. So incredibly important points when evaluating social policies to also take stock of how they're differentially felt by the weak and the strong. The work by the question, if I'm following you correctly, is politicians seem to interpret data in ways that's consistent with what they already want to do. cherry-picking data? How do you break through that policy noise? And it's a difficult question. How, as a researcher, can you influence the debate? Well, the least you can do is bring to light how these powerful forces beyond people's control are impacting their lives, their bodies. And that's part of what we try to do. Publicize your work and at least shine a spotlight on some of these dark corners of society to bring it into the debate. The second, and this is a little bit trickier, is a model of actually partnering with different political groups to have evidence be not just getting into policy, but be part of the policy process. That takes receptive politicians, and it's often, again, those who are ideologically disposed to go a particular direction. What we've been concerned about in Europe is that many are using the crisis as an opportunity to serve vested interests, an ideological agenda. So the UK NHS has now been about 49% privatized, and many healthcare insurance companies are starting to partner with the government in a different direction to try to break up the single-payer funded system. So not a perfect answer to your question, but this is a challenge that faces us all.
David, that was a wonderful presentation. Jacob Bohr from Boston University. I'm just curious how how these findings might extend to lower income, middle income countries, so-called developing countries. Seems like when you think about sort of the Preston curve, or the relationship between income and life expectancy, or wealth and longevity, can we get from the bottom left side of that to the top right side of that just through social policy, or do we need growth? I mean, so this is getting back to some of the debates that raged in the 90s, but I'm just kind of curious about your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And this links to the previous question. And one of the areas that was so important during the Great Depression, some of you will have read Sinclair's book, The Jungle, was an occupational health movement that pushed, really pushed hard, made a lot of noise to improve sanitation, working conditions, and mobilize for wider public health. That voice is becoming softer and softer in our society, in part with the declines of unions and other groups that integrate these kinds of class forces. In developing countries, turning to your question, what we're typically seeing is a model of economic growth without associated investments in health and welfare. The critical factors that we've seen make big improvements in population health and help ensure that those improvements are shared equitably. So this is not just an epidemiologic question, but it's a political question about what's the role of the state in protecting people and what kind of development low and middle income countries will go down. Could go into it more, but thanks for your question. Perfect. Shoot up there. Yeah. Turn over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're doing very well. I'm sure there's lots of people who want to socialize and network at this opportunity. So let's take a 20-minute break. And before we do that, I'd like you to join me again in thanking our keynote speaker.